Came back that evening. There was another little incident. But everything settled down. Everything had settled down. That next night, all of it started on the 14th, so the 15th was when we heard the marching.
May 15th, 1970 is a day that can never be forgotten.
And we watched as they approached the campus. They were marching as if they were marching to war. They were in lines. It appeared to be hundreds of them. I don't have a count, but as I go back, I know there was a lot of them. And we watched them from the window, and they marched down Lynch Street.
Get on the ground! On the ground! On the ground! Face down on the ground! Face down on the ground! Hands behind your back! Hands behind your back! Get him! All right. You bleeding? Yeah, I'm bleeding. Hand! Give me!
Where you shot at? In your leg?
Back of my leg.
Back of your leg, all right.
Ready?
On that day of terrible memories, there was screaming and cries of terror everywhere at this point.
Yes, sir. Hey, guns right there, guns right there.
Where?
Right there.
I need one more unit, Ocala.
Pain mingled with the noise of sustained gunfire as the students of Jackson State University struggled en masse to get through glass double doors. Several of the students were trampled in the process. Others would be struck by buckshot pellets or bullets, who fell, only to be dragged inside or left moaning bitterly in the grass. Everywhere was in a horrible disarray.
It was the highway patrol and city police. Everybody was on both sides of the campus. They came up Lynch Street.
Whatever may have actually occurred on that day cannot justify the indiscriminate killing that had taken place after.
The only communication I heard back from the police officers came from a highway patrolman who stepped up with a megaphone and said, "Ladies and gentlemen, may I have your attention?"
Please.
And it was right after that the shooting started.
All hell broke loose. Shooting.
The police had opened fire at approximately 12:05 a.m. midnight, May 15, and had continued to fire at the young offsprings of black parents for more than a good 30 seconds.
It was just like something out of a movie. When you're watching a war movie and you hear hundreds of guns shooting.
It was quick, thoughtless. The students scattered about. Some would run for the trees in front of the library, while others would scramble for the Alexander Hall West End door.
And when we realized that we were being fired upon, we turned and fell to the floor. I remember feeling something hot hitting my back.
And when they shot, we pushed right through that door right there. And when we went through there, you hear the bullets popping off the wall like firecrackers. And so after zigzagging, like we were lucky, many of us didn't get killed.
And all you could hear was, oh. I was on the ground, and I kept seeing all this fire going over my head, and I kept pulling the grass so I could get where I needed to get.
Somebody holled out, "Stop firing," or "Hold your fire." And I got up and ran into the dormitory.
When the order to cease fire was given and the gunfire ceased, Philip Lafayette Gibbs, age 21, a junior pre-law major with a wife, a child, and a baby on the way, lay dead 50 feet east of the west wing door of Alexander Hall.
I knew Philip. I'd had classes with him.
Philip, that was my classmate. Double doors. Man. Whew. They lit him up in the back first. He was trying to get in. And when he turned around, he was like this. And they used M16s and 30s. Man, it was so, boom! Took him through those doors.
2 00 buckshot pellets had punched into his head, while a third pellet entered just beneath his left eye, and a fourth just under his left armpit. Many more were down, lifeless. The 5-story dormitory was riddled by gunfire. Investigators estimated that more than 460 rounds struck the building, shattering every window facing the street on each floor. Bullet holes that can still be seen in the walls of the building till date.
I don't think there's any way you can justify firing 460 shots at a girl's dormitory for 29 and a half seconds. I don't see anything that justifies that.
That year, 1970, was a pivotal year in American history. The Vietnam War was raging on at this point in time. Widespread protests and anti-war movements would inevitably become the order of the day. On college campuses across the nation, students had begun to demand change, seeking justice, equality, and an end to the war. In Mississippi, a state scarred by racial tension and segregation, Jackson State University would stand as a beacon of hope, a historically black college, a hub of intellectual and cultural vitality. But beneath its surface, tension simmered. 11 days after the National Guard troops fired into a crowd of unarmed anti-war protesters at Kent State University in Ohio, local and state police in Mississippi would open fire on a group of students at Jackson State College in Jackson. In a 30-second barrage of gunfire, police had fired 150 rounds into the crowd, killing 2 black students and injuring dozens more. What in the world actually happened? What led to all of this? Before we go on, if you've watched up to this point, then it would mean that you've settled in for the ride. Don't forget to support our works by hitting the thumb button. Share video with friends and family to keep spreading our eye-opening black narrative, and subscribe to stay tuned in. Okay then, without further ado, let us dive in. As at May 1970, tensions were running high. The Vietnam War and the Civil Rights Movement had created a perfect storm of unrest across America. Protests against the war and demands for racial equality were sweeping the nation. In Jackson, Mississippi, these tensions were worsened by deep-seated racial divisions. The African American communities there relentlessly faced segregation, discrimination, and police brutality. Jackson State University, a historically black college, was a hub of activism and resistance. The killing of Martin Luther King Jr. just 2 years prior still weighed heavily on the community. Students and faculty at Jackson State University were actively involved in the civil rights movement, seeking justice and equality. As the anti-war movement gained momentum, students across the country demanded an end to U.S. involvement in Vietnam. The recent Kent State shootings, where National Guardsmen killed 4 students, had sent shockwaves through the nation. Against this backdrop was the Jackson State College shooting. Tension on the Jackson State campus had been mounting for some time, not from Vietnam, but from something much closer to home, racism, which frequently was played out on Lynch Street, a major thoroughfare dividing campus and used by white motorists. Before part of John R. Lynch Street was made into the Gibbs Green Plaza and walkway, it was a road that ran through the middle of the campus into downtown Jackson.
Lynch Street, during that particular time, and even before, was a thoroughfare for white people to get to and from their jobs to their homes. There was a red light at Alexander Hall and across, well, B.F. Roberts, right there. But cars used to come through there quite often. And the white citizens used to come through, and sometimes they would holler out or scream out obscenities and throw eggs and, bottles and bricks or what have you. Using the N-word.
By 1970, many white citizens have had to drive down Lynch Street and pass through Jackson State to get to their jobs downtown. Some of them would intentionally try to hit or run over students who were on their way to class or walking back to their dorm in Alexander Hall while driving through. Sometimes when white drivers stopped at the traffic light outside Alexander, they would yell racial slurs or throw glass bottles at the students who were outside.
We were constantly subjected to racist taunts. The women were always shouted out, and some sexist remarks was made to them. And I think one of the speakers for this year's occasion, Mamie Crockett, was hit by a car when she was crossing the streets here one time here at Jackson State. So yeah, civil rights, this being Jackson, Mississippi, a lot of civil rights activities, the freedom rides, the arrest of a large amount of students. Medgar Evers lived here, the COFO office, which was the spearhead of a lot of civil rights organizations, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, CORE, the Congress for Racial Equality. They all had hubs here in Jackson, Mississippi. So for sure, civil rights had to be a part of the equation that led up to the tragedy here in May of 1970.
Tensions would escalate when a series of the hit-and-run incidents would further occur, with white motorists striking black students crossing Lynch Street. The repeated accidents would spark widespread concerns and outrage among Jackson State University students, prompting them to publicly demand action and safety measures. Despite the students' demands for safety and respect, the hit-and-run incidents and verbal harassment by white motorists would continue unabated. The constant stream of cars speeding through Lynch Street, coupled with the racist insults and intimidation, created a very hostile environment to settle in. Frustrated and fed up, Jackson State University students would decide to take matters into their own hands.
I came driving through here just checking things out. There were students all over the place down here on the corner in front of Alexander Hall, and all of a sudden they started throwing bricks and rocks through my windows and broke the windows out in this Plymouth station wagon I was in, a marked WJTV news vehicle.
I saw this car coming through, and bottles and rocks were being thrown at the car.
There was a red light back there in that science building, and somebody hollered out that Charles Edwards was shot, the civil rights icon of the state. And when they said that man pulled up at that red light, they said, that's behavior. Everybody started throwing bricks at it.
The students would begin to retaliate against the abusive white drivers, throwing stones and other objects at cars that sped through the campus. Verbal confrontations would escalate, with students responding to insults from white motorists with equal force. This cycle of violence and retaliation would further inflame tensions, setting the stage for the tragic events that would sooner unfold. Young, a witness to the Jackson State University shooting, narrates his ordeal.
We had had several nights of protests, not only because of what was going on at Kent State, but every campus in this country was in an uproar about the war in Vietnam,
said Young to the reporters.
Young black males were being sent to Southeast Asia in disproportionate numbers, and we were concerned about that in addition to the historic racism there in Jackson, Mississippi. So there were several nights of protests, and I was thinking that there would just be some taunts and jeers at the law enforcement officials present and thinking nothing more would happen. But shortly after midnight on that third night, early in the morning, May 15th, actually, those students were fired upon at Jackson State.
On the 13th of that month of May, 1970, Jackson State University students were found protesting because of these issues, as well as the tragedy which had happened only days earlier, the 4th of May, at Kent State University in Ohio, where 4 Kent State students, Allison Krause, Sandra Schuer, Jeffrey Glenn Miller, and William K. Schroeder, were killed by Ohio National Guardsmen. Let's engage in a quick moment to see what really happened to these young souls at Kent State University, which would lead to their untimely demise. It was the year 1968, and Republican Richard Nixon had won election as President of the United States, partly as a result of his pledge to end the Vietnam War. Lack of success in conducting the war, which had become a quagmire for U.S. forces, with mounting casualties reported on the nightly TV news with the regularity of sports scores, had forced Nixon's predecessor, Democrat Lyndon B. Johnson, to opt not to run for re-election, in no small part because of his vilification by the growing anti-war movement focused on U.S. college campuses. During the campaign, Nixon claimed that he had a secret plan to conclude the war, and hopes for peace had grown with the establishment of direct talks between the United States and North Vietnam in Paris, though by the spring of 1970, those negotiations had stagnated. Meanwhile, the Nixon administration had undertaken a strategy it called Vietnamization, the gradual shift of responsibility for fighting the war from U.S. forces to those of the Republic of South Vietnam, with a concomitant withdrawal of U.S. troops. On April 20th, 1970, Nixon went on national television to announce that 115,500 U.S. troops had been withdrawn from Vietnam as of April 15th, and that another 150,000 troops were scheduled to leave by the end of 1971. After escalating for some 5 years, American involvement in Vietnam seemed to be winding down. It was all the more surprising then when Nixon returned to television 10 days later, on the night of April 30th, to announce that U.S. and South Vietnamese troops were mounting a major invasion of Cambodia, which had provided a haven for the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese troops. The bombing of Cambodia had begun in secret months before this announcement of the significant widening of the American war effort. Enraged responses swept college campuses across the country the next day, May 1st. Nixon's announcement of the invasion of Cambodia was greeted with several protests. At Kent State, 2 rallies were held at the Commons, a grassy open area at the center of the campus. The Commons formed a kind of natural amphitheater that was bordered on the north and south by walkways, on the northwest by the Student Union, a heating plant, and the Reserve Officers Training Course, ROTC building, on the east by Blanket Hill, a partially wooded slope that climbed to Taylor Hall, and on the southwest by dormitories. The first rally was held at the base of Blanket Hill, near the Victory Bell, a bronze locomotive bell in brick and sandstone housing that was traditionally rung to celebrate sports victories. There, attended by a crowd of some 500, a group of graduate students symbolically buried a copy of the U.S. Constitution, which they said had been murdered by Nixon. They also called for another anti-war rally to be held on the coming Monday, May 4th. Later on May 1st, Bus held a rally on the Commons to protest police treatment of black students at an earlier rally at Ohio State. That night, one of the first warm evenings of the spring, students and others gathered at the downtown bars. Sometime around 11 p.m., fueled by a mixture of alcohol and rage at the invasion of Cambodia, revelers overturned a garbage can in the middle of the street, set fire to its contents, and set upon the police who responded. When law enforcement officers returned in force to clear the streets, the revelers began breaking store windows. More than a dozen individuals were arrested, and the bulk of the students were driven from downtown back toward campus by police in riot gear. By 2:30 a.m., the disturbance was over. Nevertheless, in the early morning hours of that next day, Kent Mayor Leroy Satram, having heard rumors of plotting by radicals, declared a civil emergency and requested assistance from Ohio's staunch conservative governor, James A. Rhodes, who dispatched the Ohio National Guard. During the day on May 2nd, students helped clean up the damage downtown. More rumors flew about the threat of radical activity. At about 8 p.m., some 1,000 individuals gathered at the Reserve Officers Training Course, ROTC building, which some of the demonstrators then set on fire. As firefighters sought to contain the blaze, demonstrators pulled at and slashed fire hoses. With the conflagration burning out of control, elements of the National Guard arrived on the scene and cleared the area. By May 3rd, nearly 1,200 National Guardsmen, most of whom had been redeployed from duty policing a wildcat truckers' strike, occupied the Kent State campus. Governor Rhodes, who was campaigning for the Republican nomination to run for the U.S. Senate, flew on a helicopter to Kent to survey the scene. Presenting himself as a champion of law and order at the press conference that followed, Rhodes promised to use every part of the law enforcement agencies of Ohio to drive dissident groups out of Kent. Echoing Nixon, who had earlier called student demonstrators bums, Rhodes characterized the demonstrators as worse than the brown shirts, the communist element, night riders, and vigilantes. That night, students who were expecting a meeting with officials that never came blocked traffic on the edge of campus at the intersection of Lincoln and Main Streets. When the demonstrators grew hostile, the riot act was read, and the guard forcibly dispersed the crowd. Bayonets were used along with tear gas this time, resulting in injuries on both sides. Although Rhodes had failed to pursue his stated intention of obtaining a court order declaring a state of emergency, it was widely assumed that martial law was in effect, and that control of the campus rested with the guard rather than with university officials. Demonstrations were banned, but despite the distribution of 12,000 leaflets announcing that prohibition, many students were unaware of it when classes resumed on Monday, May 4th. By noon, on that clear, brisk day, Perhaps as many as 3,000 students congregated in and around the Commons. Gathered around the Victory Bell, roughly 500 of them were actively protesting Nixon's expansion of the war and the presence of the National Guard on campus. Another ring of about 1,000 individuals cheered their efforts, while some 1,500 more students watched from the periphery. Across the Commons, by the charred remains of the ROTC building, more than 100 guardsmen under the command of Brigadier General Robert Canterbury confronted the demonstrators with Garand M1 rifles loaded with live ammunition. Canterbury's order that the demonstrators disperse, delivered from a jeep at about midday, was not adhered to. After launching tear gas at the demonstrators near the bell, the guardsmen began advancing with bayoneted rifles across the Commons in two groups. The smaller contingent swept up the left flank of the slope, forcing demonstrators back and blocking the passageway between Prentice Hall and Taylor Hall to the east. Meanwhile, the larger force marched up Blanket Hill to the west of Taylor Hall, with demonstrators parting or retreating up and over the hill. On the other side of Taylor Hall, the guard descended onto a football practice field that was fenced on three sides. The most aggressive demonstrators were in the parking lot of Prentice Hall, several hundred feet away from the guard, so that most of the rocks they threw fell short of their target. More students lined the grounds around Taylor Hall. During their 10-minute stay on the practice field, a number of guardsmen knelt and aimed their rifles at demonstrators. Another group of guardsmen huddled briefly, later prompting speculation that in that moment they had conspired to shoot at the demonstrators. Having effectively dispersed the demonstration but feeling threatened, the more than 70 guardsmen in this contingent would begin retracing their steps up the reverse side of the hill toward the Commons. At 12:24 p.m., as they reached the crest of the hill, near an umbrella-like concrete architectural feature known as the pagoda, 28 guardsmen quickly wheeled back and over the next 13 seconds fired between 61 and 67 shots. Some of the guardsmen would discharge their weapons into the air, some others at the ground, but a reasonable number of them would fire into the crowd. 4 students were killed and 9 others were wounded, one of them paralyzed from the waist down. 2 of those killed, Jeffrey Miller and Allison Krause, who fell about 265 feet, that is 81 meters, and 343 feet, that is 105 meters away from the guard, respectively, had been actively involved in the demonstration, but the other 2 fatalities, William Schroeder and Sandra Scheuer, both shot at a distance of about 390 feet, that is 119 meters, were bystanders on their way to class. The closest victim of the shooting, Joseph Lewis, had been standing about 60 feet, or 18 meters, away from the guard. Later, there would be much debate over why the guardsmen had fired, whether they had been ordered to do so, whether they thought they had been fired upon themselves and shot in self-defense, or whether a small group of them had indeed conspired to shoot. In the chaos that immediately followed the discharge of the weapons, the guard returned to the Commons, surrounded by an enraged throng whose belligerence threatened to explode into violence that might have been answered by another fusillade by the guard. At this combustible moment, faculty marshals, led by Glenn Frank, a geology professor, successfully persuaded the students not to endanger their lives by taking on the guard. The Commons was evacuated, and Kent State Pres Robert White ordered the university closed, which had effectively remained for some 6 weeks. The Kent State shootings had provoked the biggest student strike in the U.S. history, which involved hundreds of campuses nationwide. The iconic photograph of a young woman screaming as she knelt over the body of a student was published across the national press and came to symbolize the political and cultural divide in the U.S. at the time. Going forward, the entire outbreak at Kent State was a bottom line for what was now taking place only more than a week on in Jackson State University. The students would amass themselves on Lynch Street, and a peaceful student protest would unfold on campus. On that day, approximately 100 students would march and chant slogans along the streets, calling for racial equality and an end to the war. Governor John Bell Williams would order the highway patrol to establish order on the Jackson State campus, and the students did not resist. The next day, the president of the school would meet with the students twice to listen to their concerns, but tension would continue to mount. Around 9:30 p.m. on May 14, Jackson State University students would hear a rumor that Fayette, Mississippi Mayor Charles Evers, brother of murdered civil rights activist Medgar Evers, had been killed alongside his wife. On hearing this, Students would again gather on Lynch Street and begin rioting. Amidst the riot, the Reserve Officers Training Course, ROTC building was set on fire. A streetlight was broken, and a small bonfire was built. But the riot was still, however, a small one. At this time, several white motorists would call police to complain that students had thrown rocks at their passing cars, but eyewitnesses would later prove that it was non-students, known as corner boys, who did the rock throwing. Jackson firefighters dispatched to the blaze met a hostile crowd that harangued them as they worked to contain the fire. Fearing for their safety, the firemen requested police backup. The police, who later told the media that they had received reports of gunfire in the area around the college, up to an hour and a half before they had responded to the call, would block off Lynch Street and cordon off a 30-block area around the campus. National Guardsmen, still on alert from the riot the previous night, would mass on the west end of Lynch Street. Mounted on armored personnel carriers, the Guardsmen had been issued weapons but no ammunition. 75 city policemen and Mississippi State police officers armed with carbines, submachine guns, shotguns, service revolvers, and some personal weapons would also arrive at the scene. The combined armed presence on the Lynch Street side of Stewart Hall, a men's dormitory, would stave off the crowd long enough for the firemen to extinguish the blaze and leave.
That evening, there was another little incident. But everything settled down. Everything had settled down. That next night, all of it started on the 14th, so the 15th was when we heard the marching.
And we watched as they approached the campus and were marching as if they were marching to war. They were in lines. It appeared to be hundreds of them.
After the firemen left, the police and state troopers marched along Lynch Street toward Alexander Center, a women's residence, weapons at the ready, and no one seems to know why. Falling back before the approaching officers, the students would congregate in a thick knot in front of the dormitory. At this point, the crowd numbered 75 to 100 people. Several students allegedly shouted obscene catcalls, while others would chant and toss bricks at the officers, who at this time had closed in to within 100 feet of the group. The officers would then deploy into a line facing the students. Accidentally, someone in the crowd either did drop a bottle which shattered on the asphalt with a loud pop. At the same time, an officer fell, struck by a piece of thrown debris.
The only communication I heard back from the police officers came from a highway patrolman who stepped up with a megaphone and said, "Ladies and gentlemen, may I have your attention?"
Please.
And it was right after that the shooting started. The bottle broke in the middle of the police officers, and they started firing.
By that time, one of the students threw a bottle, and the bottle burst. All hell broke loose. Shooting.
And from here, the entire story would take a new turn as different eyewitnesses give their various encounters.
And we watched them from the window, and they marched down Lynch Street. And as they came from the west, and they passed by the young men with the fire, and they came, continued till they got to the front of Alexander Hall. And we came across the hall and looked out of my dormitory room window.
It was the highway patrol and city police. Everybody was on both sides of the campus. They came up Lynch Street. I was the fence on the south side of Lynch Street in front of B.F. Roberts Dining Hall, along with other friends of mine. And on the north side were students laying on the ground in front of Alexander Hall and just, hanging out the windows.
But they marched on up there and they said, "We're going to kill some of you niggas."
The students, in my experience for the first time in the civil rights movement, were really saying nasty things to the police officers. They were calling them pigs, telling them, "Get off the campus. You don't have any business here. We don't need you here." And they were doing it at close range. I'd never seen that happen at close range before. Usually there was great distance between protesters and police officers. It'd usually be, several hundred feet. But here they were, police officers right in the middle of this street, and the protesters right over there, and you could hear each other very well.
Accounts vary as to what happened next. Some students would say that the police advanced in a line, warned them, then opened fire. Others would say that the police abruptly opened fire on the crowd and the dormitory. Some other witnesses as well would report that the students were under the control of a campus security officer when the police opened fire. But the police themselves would claim that they had spotted a powder flare in the Alexander West Hall third floor stairwell window and opened fire in self-defense on the dormitory only. 2 local television news reporters present at the shooting would agree that a shot was fired, but were uncertain of the direction. A radio reporter on the corner would claim to have seen an arm and a pistol extending from a dormitory window, but all these were done to prove the policemen innocent and off the hook. Going forward, whatever did actually occur, the police, it was said, did open fire at approximately 12:05 a.m. midnight, May 15, and had continued to fire at the young offsprings of black parents for more than a good 30 seconds. It was quick, thoughtless. The students scattered. Some would run for the trees in front of the library, while others would scramble for the Alexander Hall West End door.
And when they went to kneel, I ducked, I dived under the trees that was on this side of West Hall. And they had me pinned down by the wall and I couldn't get up. And bullets was flying all over my head.
It was just like something out of a movie. When you're watching a war movie and you hear hundreds of guns shooting. And when we realized that we were being fired upon, we turned and fell to the floor. I remember feeling something hot hitting my back.
And when they shot, we pushed right through that door right there. And we went through there, you hear the bullets popping off the wall like firecrackers. And so I was zigzagging like that. We were lucky, many of us didn't get killed. If I had to start down low, shooting low, I wouldn't have been here today to tell you about it. They would have got me.
And all you could hear was, oh. I was on the ground, and I kept seeing all this fire going over my head, and I kept pulling the grass so I could get where I needed to get.
There was screaming and cries of terror everywhere at this point. Pain mingled with the noise of sustained gunfire as the students struggled en masse to get through glass double doors. Several of the students were trampled in the process. Others would be struck by buckshot pellets or bullets, who fell, only to be dragged inside or left moaning in the grass.
Philip, that was my classmate. Double doors. Man. Whew. They lit him up in the back first. He was trying to get in. And when he turned around, he was like this. And they used M16s and 30-30s. Man, it was so, boom! Right. Took him through those doors.
When the order to cease fire was given and the gunfire ceased, Philip Lafayette Gibbs, age 21, a junior pre-law major with a wife, a child, and a baby on the way, lay dead 50 feet east of the west wing door of Alexander Hall. 2 00 buckshot pellets had punched into his head, while a third pellet entered just beneath his left eye and a fourth just under his left armpit. Across the street, behind the line of police and highway patrolmen, James Earl Green, 17, was sprawled dead in front of Benjamin F. Roberts Dining Hall. Green, a senior at Jim Hill High School in Jackson, was walking home from work at a local grocery store when he stopped to watch the action. He was standing in front of Benjamin F. Roberts Hall when a single buckshot blast slammed into the right side of his chest. The police later claimed that they had taken fire from the direction of Benjamin F. Roberts Hall. 12 other Jackson State students were struck by gunfire, including at least one who was sitting in the dormitory lobby at the time of the shooting. Several students would require treatment for hysteria and injuries from shattered glass. The injured students, many of whom lay bleeding on the ground just outside the dormitory, would be transported to University Hospital within 20 minutes of the shooting. But the ambulances were not called until after the officers picked up their shell casings. This was what the U.S. Senate probe conducted by Senators Walter Mondale and Birch Bayh later revealed. Injured and carried to University Hospital for treatment were Fonzie Coleman, Red Wilson Jr., Leroy Kenter, Vernon Steve Weekly, Gloria Mayhorn, Patricia Ann Sanders, Willie Woodard, Andrea Reese, Stella Spinks, Clemmy Johnson, Tuwayne Davis, and Lonzie Thompson. The 5-story dormitory was riddled by gunfire. FBI investigators would estimate that more than 460 rounds struck the building, shattering every window facing the street on each floor. Investigators counted at least 160 bullet holes in the outer walls of the stairwell alone, bullet holes that can still be seen in the walls of the building till date. The police and state troopers would leave the campus shortly after the shooting and would be replaced by the National Guardsmen. After the incident, Jackson authorities would deny that the city police took part in the fusillade, that the highway patrolman fired was never at issue. At the Jackson hearings, the administration, faculty, staff, and students testified that till date, there had been no convictions or arrests. In closing, the Jackson State shootings exemplify the entrenched racism and social injustices of the 1970s in America. The tragic loss of Philip Gibbs and James Green, coupled with the injured students, underscores devastating consequences of systemic racism and police brutality in the U.S. No convictions or arrests were made, highlighting impunity and lack of accountability. This incident was part of a broader narrative of racial tensions and violence. We remember the victims, acknowledging the event's impact on the civil rights movement and ongoing struggle for racial justice. Confronting America's painful past and present, we strive for a future where such tragedies would never have to repeat itself ever again. This brings us to the end of yet another touching video on the painful history of the people of color in the U.S. Do not fail to support our consistency by hitting the thumb button, share video with friends and families to keep spreading our eye-opening Black narrative, and kindly consider subscribing and stay tuned in with us if you are yet to. We are delighted to have you. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next video.